Hey guys, this is miicrow here with the quickly approaching Season 5 update here. I wanted to talk about my favorite artifact that's coming out and the ways that it can transform what is good for PvP, and I think generally this artifact will have a very big impact on the meta, but not a lot of people realize it, and that artifact is Ironheart. Ironheart is an artifact that is exclusively available to medium wearers that gives you a 20% increase in health, which allows you to do really creative things with your builds. Now, Ironheart directly is competing against Tumbler feat wraps, but I want to kind of go through why I think this artifact is better than Tumbler feat wraps in most situations, especially for bruiser classes. And I don't think it's super intuitive, but what it basically comes down to is if you favor Ironheart, you're favoring 20% more HP, which translates to about 4k more health. And if you favor Tumbler feat wraps, you tend to be favoring this 25% fortify, as well as this shirking heal, albeit I don't really think the shirking heal aspect is a major highlight of Tumbler feat wraps. Like it's significant enough to like be notable, but it's not like a deal breaker. And the reason why we don't have to worry about the empower aspect on here from a PvP perspective is because we can go shirking empower on our amulet, which is, I would argue, a better version of this empower effect because it lasts for 10 seconds, but you only get 4% per dodge, if that makes sense. So if getting 15% for 5 seconds, you get 10 seconds for 4%, and that 4% stacks up to 16%. So it lets you do basically the same damage. I would argue a little bit more consistently more damage, and you give up this fortify for the extra HP. Now that translation between giving up the fortify, for example, I graphed that here in Desmos. I have this graph of like available. I'll put it in the description below too, but I've used this for like featherweight and stuff like that. But if we look at New World Buddy as a reference here, I have the builds mapped out here. We have one where it's just one build, and we have another where we're looking at comparing how much damage this build will do to another person, which is a really cool new feature that New World Buddy added. But anyways, going to the New World Buddy itself, we could see that when we plug in the stats for this build I'm going to be talking about here, you have 1.7k armor, which is basically the same armor as being in heavy due to the passive that I'm running on flail. If I look at that in here compared to having the 25% fortify, which is on the right here, versus having no fortify, you're effectively about 5% tankier with the 25% fortify while on medium. So this is the benefit that you run into when running Tumbler's feat wraps, that you will be 5% more tanky. So that means if you have heals incoming, that heals the heals that are incoming will effectively be 5% more effective to your HP bar because you will have less HP that needs to be healed for the same amount of damage mitigation, if that makes sense. Because you're resisting more damage, heals become more effective on you in this case. But we can compensate for that with our perks that we can run on our gear, which I want to talk about today. But basically, Ironheart, what it allows you to do is if you say you're a player that likes health, so there's two camps here. There's people that like health and people that don't like health. If you're a person that likes health on your gear, that health perk is valued at 2.4%, I believe, on armor and 7% on an amulet. You can effectively, by running this one artifact, just remove all those health pieces, free up 6 perk slots, and use those to get more damage mitigation, which is really cool and lets you have the benefits of having health while still having damage mitigation present from additional armor perks that you can acquire. If you're a person that does not believe in health, and you're a person that, you know, prefers to have the damage reduction over the increase into HP, which I usually am, I just think this case pushes the health over the top because 20% is such a high value. I'm usually in that camp. In that case, you're basically getting a free amulet perk slot, right? Because you don't have to take that 7%, you could take something else, which is where we come back to that idea with our gear set here that I put together as just like a sample piece, albeit some of these things haven't saved. We can run shirking empower on here, and shirking empower on our amulet will just allow us to have that same damage. Divine is a very underrated perk. Honestly, this could probably be health as well, or a different perk, but a lot of people have been cutting like stam recovery as of recent from melee PvP, like melee focused OPR/war, because upon inspection, it saves you a lot less than you would think, because gaining 105 stamina when you have 110 total, if you stam out and it procs, you're still going to be 5 off, right? And in that brief window between 105 and 110 stam where it's charging up, you often can die. So sometimes it's not super helpful, and the times where it is helpful, it is a little bit niche enough to where I think Divine makes more sense. This just makes it so that incoming heal effectively is more effective. You're more resistant versus disease effects, as well as this build. We don't just have to stack Divine, right? We can go 50 focus because I'm doing it with a flail setup. I'll click through the flail tree here that I was proposing. There were some nerfs that are coming to flail that I kind of wanted to talk about too, but I think that's relatively minor. For this video, I want to focus on kind of the power that Ironheart has altogether. And there's a few things going on in this build that are a little bit more advanced. One of which is Whirling Blade. We actually go to the patch notes here and we search for Whirling Blade. Whirling Blade got a very, very big buff where it was capping out at 52% total base damage for hitting targets, to where if you're hitting 5 targets with Whirling Blade now, you're going to do 24% times 5. That's 120 base damage. That's twice the amount of base damage that you're getting before, and that attack is going to do a lot of damage. I'm talking about hitting for 5-6k as an AoE on multiple people, and it refreshes its own cooldown with one of the passives. It is incredibly strong, and I imagine this is going to have somewhat of an impact on the at least SNS meta. We might see more people go Butcher, because Butcher is inherently strong with this, since you get a bleed passive on that. It lets you charge ult very, very fast, and overall, a Butcher is just a really, really good sword to have. So we can kind of combine those ideas, go for SNS, go with Flail, go medium. The idea behind this is you have SNS and you have Flail, versus if you go for a different offhand, is that your shield's going to be out all the time. We can run, sorry, I'm going fast here, but we could run the Kite Shield that got fixed, Immutable Resolve, which this Refreshing Defiance wasn't there before. It was actually giving a base damage. The Refreshing is a little bit more helpful in this case. Lets us get to a passive 26% Refreshing, which is insane. And that, stacked with Butcher, stacked with Flail, will basically allow us to just use cooldowns over and over and go somewhat infinite. So this is like a prototype build, for example, where you take it from heavy, go to medium, you're just as tanky because you're running this Immutable Resolve shield, since you can just have insane amounts of wards. What I came up here at the end of the day is that I have 15% general ward with this hypothetical build to everything. Got 30% to fire because fire staff's really, really strong, and I have around 20% to everything physical, which is extremely tanky, and it does okay damage as well, albeit it's not great damage. But the point here was to kind of come up with something that could be disruptive to the current meta, and something that could be swapped in and out for a few pieces that could transform this into be something that is meta. So like, for example, you might not want to run the Flail, might not want to fully rely on the shield, go for a light shield, for example, with the SNS, and then go for like a Great Axe as a secondary, or a Great Sword, or a Spear. Like those things are viable, but the point is that you can go from heavy to medium with this artifact and gain a decent amount of benefits. You gain 15% base damage as part of the nerf to heavy and medium. Heavy is going to have 15% less base damage per attack on this next patch. Medium's going to have 10% less base damage per attack. Light's going to have 5% less, unless you're a light melee, in which case it's going to be the same as the last patch. Those are the overarching changes. I would go through these in more detail, but I think that would be relatively boring. I'm trying to do something different here, with kind of going through an example of how a meta could change what is viable and what actually gear is good. Because what this allows us to do is we're able to fully stack Refreshing, which we weren't able to do before. Stack a bunch of Elemental Aversion, got the okay amount of Enchanted Wards, stack Conditionings, and we just overall are very tanky to everything in the meta. Like when I was talking about the 20% to physical here, it's realistically closer to 30%. You don't get hit by a lot of Warhammer fights as someone that like is more of a disruptor for a lot of Warhammers, and that's their main source of strike damage. There's some of it from Spear, from the Cyclone as well, but you're just overall with this kind of build and this kind of idea, you become super, super tanky because you can run Ironheart, pick up all these perks. You're more survivable in burst damage situations because you have the passive health, and you don't give up damage here because of the ability to slot in the Shirking Empower on your amulet, if that makes sense. So, like, the idea here is if you go Ironheart, you could drop Tumblers, cut your health on basically everything, you have the same amount of damage, and the only thing that you give up is 5% damage reduction. That 5% is a multiplicative factor that is scaling with other factors that are going to reduce your damage. So even though this is 5% in this case, or maybe 5.5%, it would probably be closer to like 7-8% in actuality when everything kind of gets multiplied and adds up. But you still see the idea here. We're able to gain that 4k HP. You don't lose too much, lose out on a little bit of inconsistency that you get with the tumblers, and just overall just gain benefits. And that's like one reason why I think this Ironheart artifact is really, really cool. Another thing I put in this build that we don't talk about, or hasn't really been talked about that much, I think is super important to talk about, is Jasper's getting fixed next patch. Jasper, for people that did not know, was bugged, where if you had a Runeglass gem, it was not stacking on a Retaliate perk, so it was supposed to do 18% Empower damage. Like I say Empower damage because it's not base damage, it's an Empower thing, which is actually beneficial for a lot of classes because it lets you like work against Weaken, which will actually increase your damage more than a base damage increasing effect, which every other gem in the game increases your base damage except for Retaliate. So Retaliate's in a very interesting spot where it's actually ideal for a lot of like kind of not ranged, kind of melee oriented builds that are fighting in situations that are like closer up. Like for example, for a long time it was run on Warhammer because it actually increased the Warhammer damage more than it did to run in a different gem there, and that's something that could come back with this patch. But the one thing it also helps a lot with too is for your flail, for your for SNS, because we are running that Whirling Blade, right? And Whirling Blade has 120% base damage. We don't care about adding to 120%. We want to max out our Empower, and Retaliate's a really good way to do that. So we can add in those Retaliate gems, and that will just boost our damage a little bit more. For this example, on the flail, I went for a cheese combo that some people like to go for, where you go for Trenchant Rend, Plague Strikes. So the idea here is if you hit someone with Trip, which Bludgeon got nerfed on this patch too, so that's something that we haven't talked about as much, but this is going to change the tank meta a lot. If we look up Flail here, Flail's Warding Bludge Siphon spell, this is what the kind of the code name is for Warding Bludge's Best Friends passive, where Best Friends before was able to link to multiple people and not just one person, which made it a top 5 ability in the game in my opinion. I would say this, with this nerf where it's only going to link to one person, this is like a top 15, maybe 20 ability in the game, if that makes sense. Like, it's a very significant nerf because you can't just dump this in a clump and just win every single clump fight, whether it be OPR, War, PvE. It was run a lot in PvE too for speedruns. Like, that mechanic is no longer going to be nearly as good. Or it's non-existent, so it's just something that people are more likely to drop. And an alternative avenue to get success on the flail was to go for a Trip combo here, because your Trip has a heavy attack at the end. So you could have that heavy attack apply 2 Rends, because there's a Rend associated with the You Got Flail passive. It will also apply a disease from the Plague Strikes, also apply an effect that will reduce the damage of dots on people if they hit them, which doesn't really matter that much. But it also gives you a haste, and if you want to pick up this passive on the right, will also transfer a debuff for you onto the target. So it's basically, you hit someone with this Trip, and it might just kill them. And when you have a bunch of CDR, it turns out that Trip with this kind of combo is relatively good. By a bunch of CDR, we already went over that, like 25%. You also have Epic Flail here, which will reduce its own cooldown, 5% per hit. If you look at Whirling Blade, it also has a similar thing where it's 5% per enemy hit. You get a reduced cooldown. So like both of these skill trees just inherently benefit from having tons of refreshing. And that's something we're able to get in this kit that we weren't able to get before, and something that might enable this kind of build to exist because of Ironheart. So that's something I thought was kind of cool, kind of show you guys like a theoretical build in that process. And then also from a New World Buddy perspective, if you guys have used this recently, you can actually choose an opponent that you're against now, and it'll show the scaling in terms of what damage you did. So I've made 2 builds here, one where I only went 200 con, one where I went 350 con, and the damage difference is relatively low. Like, you're losing out on around a little under 20% damage by dropping to 350 con, but become a lot more tanky. You gain like 6k HP, which is like one of the reasons why I run a relatively tanky meta right now, because health scaling is just inherently better than damage scaling for some things. But kind of cool to see this kind of point of view as well. And you can go through here and like see how much damage like each kind of effect gives. Like, if you go back to this, we pull up the calculator here, we could actually see, I forget where it is. There's a spot where oh no, it's like here, where you can see what kind of attack is going off and like what kind of damage it would do. So like if I look at a swipe damage ability that has 120 damage coefficient, then it's going to do this much damage. So you can kind of see how much damage like scaling you'll do with certain effects. This is still, I think, not completely polished, but still good. But the idea here is you can hit to like 4 to 5k with your Whirling Blade, and that's the main thing that this build's kind of focused around. So let me know what artifacts you guys think are excited for. I know a lot of people are really excited for the base damage artifact that removes Empower, but that's one that I think is kind of heavily, a little bit overrated. Won't be as good, but it did just get a recent buff with the Odo. Or sorry, not with Odo, with Tether, because Tether is actually going to work with Nature's Wrath now, so you can use that with Tether, go Musket or something like that, and you'll be able to do 20% more base damage. The only thing is I'm pretty sure if you go for the medium pants, you'll just end up doing more damage overall with that kind of class. And there's a few other classes that have a similar thing where base damage in this game is inherently not super useful at a certain point because it's just so heavily, or it's just given too much, and you're like oversaturating one bucket. And like we've talked about in the past, you want to multiply these factors by each other to get to the biggest value, which means you want to maximize each individual factor. So if you're like overstacking one factor and not using the others, you're not going to take advantage of multiplicative scaling, which is something that really boosts your damage and really boosts your survivability if you're trying to scale the other way around. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. A couple of these artifacts are pretty cool. Most of them, I would say, are less cool. Phoenix, with the recent changes that is happening to it, is also an interesting spot where it's likely not cheesable anymore, and it could enable light melee to come back, since Phoenix effectively will make you get an extra life, but you have 5 seconds to get a kill, and if you don't get a kill, you die. As well as it basically just doesn't let you have incoming heals with this reduced health by 200, or reduced healing by 200%. That basically says that incoming heals will not be effective for you. Like disease, for reference, is like a negative like 150% modifier, so it's like more effective than that even. But you do have 5 seconds to try to get something else. The other thing this enables too that I think is going to worry people a lot is something like a musket, for example, that runs very low con. If you get like tapped across the map, you might be able to trade out in the span of 5 seconds to the musket if you know that you need to trade out. Like you definitely have the ability for these light damage oriented, or like really squishy oriented classes to take advantage of this amulet to perhaps live longer than you were able to before, and it's something that will allow players that were, tinkering a little bit on the edge to just live a bit better. Also, from like an OPR standpoint, say you got this debuff and you were standing next to a wolf or standing next to one of like the zombies or whatever, like you can just kill those, and then that would get rid of this debuff and you would just be able to live again. So noteworthy mechanic there that will be useful in OPR, but will be interesting to see how this impacts other game modes as well. It could be really nice in PvE, like say you're on a Blight keeper and she is able to get her like kind of just the thing off, or would just nuke everyone would die. You have 5 extra seconds to be able to kill her before the game like ends, basically. Like you're not able to do that and you have to reset your run in terms of PvE. So there's like a few spots where this could be really useful. I think it's really going to be a quite impactful amulet, just people aren't talking about it as much, and it'll be kind of interesting to see what happens there. But yeah, let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next one.